Welcome to the Content Matters podcast, where digital content and marketing pros talk shop. Tech may be changing fast, but great content is timeless. Get inside tips, trends, and practical know-how from the top minds in the digital content industry. Sponsored by Ingeniix, the uniquely agile content management platform. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to the Content Matters podcast, where we will talk to industry experts on all things content management and digital experience. I'm really happy to introduce today Deane Barker, who is Chief Strategy Officer at Blend Interactive. They're a consultancy that helps institutions and agencies build really great websites. And Deane has lots of experience, over 20 years experience in the content management industry. And he's the author, if you haven't read it, you should get it, of Web Content Management Systems, Features, and Best Practices. That's published through O'Reilly. Deane is going to talk to us today specifically about headless content management, which is, I'm going to call it the latest craze, but maybe it's not a craze. Maybe it's kind of the future of content management. We'll kind of get right into that. Welcome, Deane.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So let's kick it off with a really simple, your definition of what headless content management is.
Well, yeah, it's funny, you called it the latest craze, and you said maybe it's not a craze. And it's true, it's not a craze, but interestingly, it's also not the latest, because if you look at it kind of in a long view, from someone who's been doing CMS for a long time, it's really how we used to build content management systems, really. Headless CMS is fundamentally a content-focused repository and generally accessible remotely. So it's a content-focused database, content-focused repository that exposes a remote API that you would connect to from your presentation layer, from your runtime, whatever you're using to deliver content, to retrieve and search and manipulate content however you need to, which fundamentally, if you go way back to like the late 90s when we were building websites in classic ASP and kind of, PHP 3, that's basically how we were building websites. We had templates focused runtimes, which were just randomly pulling content out of databases. The only difference now is that the database is remote and we have an API in front of it.
And that's interesting, because that's kind of what we were talking about. I was talking about with someone else, was that, it feels like it goes back 20 years to the way we used to do content management, but it's not like that exactly. Like, there are some really good advantages to using headless today, and probably some disadvantages. So what do you kind of see as the key advantages and some of the disadvantages to using it?
Well, the advantages, it depends who you ask, and a lot of these comments can get very, very kind of political based on the spin that a vendor wants to put on it. But one of the advantages is there's a certain leanness to it, right? Because all you're dealing with is a repository which you can manipulate in any way. And the reason why this has become important is because now we have front-end frameworks that are talking directly to repositories. I mean, things like React or like Vue would make calls directly into repositories. And that's to say nothing of display advertising and mobile apps and the Internet of Things. These are things that are making calls directly into repositories. And when this became a thing, when people were coming up with these channels that just needed to make raw calls to repositories, the people were looking at the existing spate of content management systems and saying, well, they're very bloated. They have aspects that we don't need to use. And so one of the advantage of it would be kind of the leanness of it. The disadvantage is that a lot of people are using headless CMSs for silly reasons, I guess. A lot of people are using headless CMSs to avoid using a web content management system. They're building websites out of headless CMSs, which I think is a little counterproductive. I think there's a lot of web-specific functionality that has been built into the modern web CMS that people are just having to replicate with headless CMS. So used for the right application, headless CMS has a lot of advantages. Used to replace a traditional web content management system, which solves the accumulated set of problems that we've been dealing with for 25 years on the web, I think it's kind of a waste of effort.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So there are some new, or not, maybe not new, there are some CMS vendors who are coming out now with a hybrid CMS, which sounds like it's the best of both worlds, gives you both headless capabilities and some traditional website experience management. Do you see that as the middle ground that works the best, or how would you look at the hybrid?
Well, so I'm absolutely a proponent of this. Um, uh, as someone who works fundamentally on the web. I mean, if you're coming from mobile apps or something like that, you might have a different opinion. But as somebody who works on the web, I think that the hybrid model is the way to go. And the industry can't seem to settle on a name for this. Some people are calling it hybrid headless. I've heard it called also headless. I've heard it called headless optional. No one can kind of settle on a name for this. But the idea is that you have a traditional web CMS, which does web very, very well, but it also has a very, very competent headless component to it. So, and you're seeing this in the traditional marketplace. You're seeing all the traditional web CMS vendors really beefing up their remote APIs. Some of them have remote APIs to start with, but they're really kind of beefing up and promoting their remote APIs. So what they're saying is that you can build a really great website with this, but you can also use it headlessly. And I think this is a great model because I think for many, many organizations, certainly not all, but for many organizations, the web is the dominant channel. I said this, I keynoted a vendor conference and I gave the developer keynote and I said, for most organizations, the web is the dominant channel. And somebody called me out on LinkedIn the next day and they said, yeah, we're from Asia. And that's not the case at all. Over in Asia, it's very much kind of mobile app centric. So I think that there's a difference maybe culturally or geographically, but for most organizations, certainly in North America, we're really concentrated on the web channel, but we have other headless needs. And if you have a traditional web CMS that also does headless very well, I think that's a great position to be in.
Are there some of these, hybrid vendors that say they have headless, but it's not like, is there something specific you need to look for to know that they too truly offer headless?
No, I don't think headless. I think headless kind of defies a very specific definition.
Yeah.
I think headless is a competent remote API. Now, people are going to argue that. Vendors are going to come in and saying, no, headless means this, this, and this. But the fact is, this movement in the industry, I don't even want to call it a technology because it's not really a specific technology. It's a movement. It's a cultural approach or perspective to content management that's been building for a while. But it just defies a specific definition. No vendor can lay claim to the word headless. No vendor can define it how they want. People are going to try to define it, but I think in general we're talking about remote access of managed content. If you can do that to some extent, I think you can lay claim to the mantle of headless.
Okay, that makes sense. So if you had to sell headless to your CMO, like I can see selling it to your CIO. That sounds pretty straightforward. They're pretty tech savvy. But to your CMO, is it a challenge to sell headless, and how would you do that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a challenge to sell into marketing. Headless is being sold into marketing through the idea of what I call reflected value, right? So developers are going to a CMO and they're saying, look, if you give us a headless CMS instead of a traditional CMS, we'll be able to turn quicker. Faster development and faster time to market. That's really how they're selling this stuff to marketing. Is they're saying, this will make your developers happy. They won't have to learn like a big CMS. They'll be able to move faster. We'll be able to use the technologies we want to use, and that will reflect value back on them. Do I think there is inherent value to headless for CMO? Not really, I guess. I mean, headless systems are not doing much in the way of marketing tools. There is one headless vendor that I know has A/B testing, but I really don't know of many headless vendors that have personalization. And then, of course, headless systems kind of reject the concept of the page entirely. So right. Headless systems are not big on kind of what you see is what you get in terms of like page layout and composition. They don't even have a concept of the page. And so I don't think headless holds any inherent value for marketers. The value of headless for marketers is that it's going to make your development team faster, more nimble, more agile. Those are the claims anyway. I'm throwing out a lot of buzzwords. I don't necessarily endorse them all, but that's the approach. Okay.
So knowing that they can't, that it is purely, content repository serving up content. There are some, I heard that there are some headless CMS vendors who are starting to actually build in that front end capability into their solutions. So does that kind of defeat the idea of headless, and it kind of just starts to turn them into another kind of, I guess, I don't like the word traditional, but I can't think of another way to say it, traditional CMS vendor?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And this is what we're going to see. We're going to see headless vendors realizing that to compete with traditional CMSs, right now, headless vendors are in what they call a blue ocean market. And the blue ocean market is it's wide open. They have a bunch of people that don't want a traditional CMS. They absolutely want a headless CMS. So they have all these opportunities. But eventually those opportunities start to run out and they come in conflict more and more with traditional CMS. So they move from a blue ocean market to a red ocean market. And when they come into contact with traditional CMSs, with their marketing tools and their page composition tools and things like that, I think you're going to see a lot of headless vendors start adding more traditional tools. And I think the form this is going to come in is headless vendors are going to have website builder add-ons. And we're starting to see this in the marketplace now. But either headless vendors or their partners are going to make systems that make it easier to build a website with their tool. Like they are going to release APIs and frameworks that handle things like URL mapping and things like navigation and things like that. And we're starting to see that a little bit now. You see some headless vendors now that are offering JavaScript libraries that you can embed in your website that give click-to-edit functionality. So they know where a certain headless element has been rendered on a page, and they can give this kind of click-to-edit. So you click that, and you go directly into the headless repository to edit that piece of content. Additionally, there's one headless vendor that's offering a landing page builder system. So it has a way that you can spatially orient elements on a page surface, which really is just a low fidelity page composition engine. So we're seeing headless vendors edge into this market. And do I think that headless vendors will eventually become at the same level as traditional vendors and just become traditional vendors? I don't know. I don't think so. I think they have a long, long way to go. Traditional vendors have been doing this for like 25 years. And so there's an awful lot of ground to make up there. And also, at what point do they kind of walk away from their roots? At what point do they like, well, we're not really a headless vendor anymore. We really are a traditional vendor with just a remote repository. So the line between headless and traditional is going to get blurry. I think there's a lot of blurring that would need to happen for them to be the same thing. So.
Yeah, okay. So you have spoken about this idea of a distributed architecture for content management, which is not headless. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so distributed CMS, I think, is probably the next big trend. I think this is where CMS is going. I think to some extent, we're going to look back at the idea of serving a large web property from a single CMS as maybe a little naive. I think a great role for headless CMSs is to support a more traditional CMS. I think we may see situations where an organization has a traditional CMS to handle things like marketing and marketing automation and page composition and things like that. But more, I would say, simple and direct content management might be done in other systems. And I'll give you an example. Let's say that you have a retail website, a website for a retailer of some kind. And there are all sorts of landing pages and marketing pages and all sorts of very rich, media-heavy stuff that's done in a traditional CMS. But you also have a store locator. Well, the store locator, that's very, very simple. I mean, really, store locators can almost be done in a spreadsheet, right? It's rows and columns. And you have a different group of people that manage the store locator. So this is done by some production team, not necessarily the marketing and editorial team. It needs to be a very, very simple interface. You don't want to train them on the larger CMS. They have a very, very limited kind of task direction. They just have to maintain the store locator. That would be ideal to do in a headless CMS. Give them a headless CMS where they can just manage their store listings and then bring that into the larger marketing CMS for presentation. And I think the idea of distributed CMS is that your actual content management system will become a content provider management system. It'll be a system that serves quite a bit of content by itself, but it also orchestrates and directs some back-end content providers, which are generating content through other means. Either a headless CMS, or it might be a digital asset management system, or kind of a video production system, or a VR system. And what they're doing is they're bringing that content into a CMS for the last mile of delivery. And that's the idea that I'm calling distributed CMS. Mark Grannon from Forrester has called it Agile CMS. Sam Bagwat from Gatsby.js has called it a content mesh. But I think the idea, the common thing we're talking about is that your frontline CMS that kind of receives the inbound requests from your visitors might just orchestrate a diverse array of content providing systems, and that might be the real value that it provides.
Would that be the same if you said you have like a component content management system where you have like tech docs somewhere and you want to expose those to a website, to a portal or a website or whatever, and that's kind of the distributed architecture? That's another example of it?
Yep, absolutely. We have a lot of clients that are using technical documentation systems like RoboHelp or Weber to generate static technical documentation.
Right.
But they're like, well, we have to put that on a subdomain or something because like that's not in our CMS. And I reject that. I think there are ways to bring that into your CMS and use it like a content provider. You could use like a reverse proxy, or you could use a batch import and update. There are a number of different ways to bring that into your frontline CMS. And so they are presented to your visitor as part of a seamless integrated whole, and they don't look like they come from a separate system. And it's the idea of your content management system distributing its content providers.
How far off do you see this model becoming mainstream anytime soon?
So I think we're there in terms of custom implementations. My company does that all the time. We do situations where we're bringing in content. I think the real turn on this is going to be a set of common practices and vendor adoption and support. You're going to see vendors that are going to embrace this idea of a distributed model. They're going to offer specific tools and toolkits and frameworks and code libraries to make this easier. There was a CMS vendor 7, 8, 9 years ago. They've since become a traditional mainstream vendor. They were a bit ahead of their time. And I won't give you the vendor's name, but they advertised themselves as a federated content hub. And this was kind of their jam, right? You use their system, and what they did is they federated and integrated and kind of curated all these external content systems. And that's what they were. They were kind of a Swiss Army knife for dragging content in under the same umbrella, the same banner. And they were a bit ahead of their time. They're since morphed into more of a mainstream vendor, and they're not really pursuing that angle anymore. But I think what we're going to find is vendors that embrace this model. And they go to organizations and they say, look, we know you have a lot of content sources. Look at all the tools that we offer to embrace these external content providers and bring them in and provide value-added services. Like we can provide integrated analytics and integrated security management and common design templates to bring all this stuff together so it looks like this seamless integrated whole. So when vendors realize this is happening, and when a certain group of vendors decide we are going to offer tools to allow this, I think that's when we'll hit a tipping point.
Where do you see the CMS in 10 years?
I think the lower end of the CMS market continues to get eaten up by website builders like Squarespace and Wix, and I think the upper end of the market will distribute. I think the mid-market might stay more or less traditional or headless, right? So you would have a traditional CMS or a headless CMS, but the bottom end of the market will be packaged solutions. The top end of the market will distribute quite a bit. The middle of the market might stay roughly like we see.
Okay. So final question, and goes to the name of our podcast, Content Matters. Why does content matter in a multi-channel digital landscape?
I don't know that the multi-channel landscape has really changed the equation of content, but I think content matters because content is the answer to a question. I think fundamentally every organization is trying to provide value by answering their customers' questions. And I always think when somebody searches for something on the internet, searches an information source for an answer, I think there's kind of some, I don't want to be too dramatic about it, there's some weirdly solemn duty of us providing the answer to that question. I always think about XKCD cartoon where somebody is searching to some deeply strange programming question, and they found a search result of somebody who had that same question, and I hit it and it's a 404, and they're like, what did you know? What did you know? They're like trying to talk through time to this person because this person had the answer some time ago. And I always think it's funny that when you have a question, you search and you find one person that had that same question as you, and you're like, oh my God, I'm not alone, right? Somebody else has had the same question as me. And so I think content is fundamentally the attempt to answer our customers' questions. I think there's a duty to that. I think there's some level of honor in that, and that's why I think that content matters.
Thank you very much, Deane. I really appreciate it. That was a really quick, we went through a lot of stuff in a really short period of time, and that was great. Lots of great stuff there.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Content Matters is sponsored by Ingenix, an agile CMS platform. I invite you to come to ingenix.com to learn more about the podcast and the stuff that we're working on. And make sure you subscribe to us to get the next updates. Next time, we'll actually be talking to Matt Hines from Hines Marketing, and we're going to be talking about account-based marketing. Thanks a lot, Deane.
Thank you.